Hey everyone, Ridden here, and thank you for coming. And today, we're going to be taking a deeper look, spoilers ahead, for episode 6 of season 1, the finale of Marvel Studios' latest Disney Plus show, Loki. Welcome back everyone, and yes, the finale of Loki is finally here, and what a way to go out. For all time, always, Jonathan Majors, Kang the Conqueror, has finally arrived in the MCU. Let me come right out and say that I really enjoyed this episode. We came in anticipating that the man behind the curtain could ultimately be either Kang or He Who Remains, and it turns out we were right on both fronts, as it was in fact He Who Remains, as it was so eloquently put by Miss Minutes.
Who's impressed?
He Who Remains.
But two things being true, it was also in fact Kang, as we find out that Kang, played by Jonathan Majors, is the man behind the veil and the one controlling the TVA, and one of the best character reveals and best kept secrets possibly in the MCU thus far. I like the decision here by Marvel to simply combine the two characters, as outside of He Who Remains' residence in the Citadel at the end of all time as the final director of the TVA in the comics, and him dealing with the time twisters and awaiting the next universal cycle, there really wouldn't have been much more to do with the character, and we might not have ever seen him in the MCU otherwise. So having that entire persona simply be rolled into Kang's overall storyline works well for me, honestly. There are various versions of Kang throughout the comics, mainly those being Iron Lad, Kid Immortus, the Scarlet Centurion, Ramatut, and Immortus. Here it was seen what we have is a blend of He Who Remains with characteristics and a backstory somewhat similar to that of Immortus, in the way of him being an older, more experienced and world-ravaged warrior and time traveler. And the way Jonathan Majors portrayed him in this episode was brilliant, as I love the quirky know-it-all personality we see on full display from his initial introduction up until his ultimate demise at the hands of Sylvie. Before we actually got to the episode, we got a really awesome montage of many of the greatest audible key moments from the MCU thus far, with things such as Wakanda Forever, How About a Dance Off, and many other phrases being played over our typical Marvel Loki opening, before getting a wide shot of our Earth, space, the galaxy, and the universe it resides in relation to everything else. We also hear the same song played here that leads us into the episode that was played over the last scene of Endgame that we saw Peggy and Steve dancing to, which is It's Been a Long Time by Harry James and Helen Forrest, which is very fitting considering the context of this series and that moment. The episode started out right where we left off last week, with Loki and Sylvie preparing to enter the Citadel. The waiting and suspense of this moment was very well done, because when the doors finally opened, I was bursting with excitement and anticipation, only to be nearly scared out of my skin by Miss Minutes pulling a jump scare on us. I'm very happy they chose to take the opportunity to add an element of mischievousness to her character, as early on in the series I picked up on there being a bit of an underlying sinisterness to her existence. It also turns out that while we were focused on Ravonna knowing what was going on the whole time, we had it wrong, as it was actually Miss Minutes who had been clued in since the beginning, as we see her trying to offer Loki and Sylvie with Faustian bargains to get them to go away.
He's been making a few creative adjustments so we can reinsert both of y'all back into the timeline and y'all can live the lives you've always wanted.
Loki is offered the chance to win the Battle of New York and kill Thanos and even get the Infinity Gauntlet, while Sylvie is offered the chance to simply live out her life and her dreams, and they can ultimately do it together. But this is to no avail as Loki and Sylvie press on. The Citadel itself is immense and seems to be sporting cracks throughout, which could be representative of the cracks throughout time. When Loki and Sylvie enter another hall, we see 4 statues, one of which has been smashed, which leads me to believe that maybe Kang was the 4th Timekeeper all along. When He Who Remains does appear, I found it interesting that he does so with an apple, as the apple is known far and wide as the forbidden fruit. And in relating it further in this instance to Loki and Sylvie, they are sort of like Adam and Eve, as He Who Remains tempts them throughout the entire episode, referring to himself as the devil, with the possibility of ruling a timeline together with infinite untapped knowledge. I also want to call out the similarity of the elevator scene as they make their way up to his office, as it's a similar setup to what we've seen prior, with Ravonna escorting the pair down to the Timekeeper's vault prior as she stood behind him. Here we see Kang standing in front of Loki and Sylvie as they make their way up, clearly being representative of Kang being at the head of all of this all along, and Ravonna being even further in the dark about it all, even more so than Loki and Sylvie were. This sequence was great as we see Loki and Sylvie try to kill him, revealing the fact that he too has a temp pad, and as a result they are incapable of doing so, as Kang also acknowledges that he's simply a man of flesh and blood.
Not what you were expecting,
You're just a man.
Flesh and blood.
Just a little bit easier to kill.
Kang also confirms here that Sylvie is in fact a Loki, as some of us had possibly hoped she wasn't, and that maybe her variance was being adopted by Odin and Hela instead of Loki, which would have made the whole falling in love with another version of yourself thing just a little less weird. We see him here in an outfit of robes very similar to that of Immortus from the comics.
Loki.
Wrapping back around to the TVA, we finally got our reunion between Mobius and Ravonna, and for me, I think it was just as satisfying as I hoped that it would be. We see her look down at the rings on the table, clearly missing her friend Mobius, who then shows up and accosts her for everything that's taking place. Ultimately, Ravonna gets away after manhandling Mobius and saying she's going to find free will. We find out via Hunter B-15 that Ravonna was in fact a high school teacher at Franklin D. Roosevelt High School in 2018, which is where the blue pens we saw earlier in the series came from. And this is where we see another version of Ravonna clearly not in the know about the TVA surface, as Hunter B-15 tells Hunter U-92 the truth, before I'm sure she told everyone else back at the TVA. This leaves things in a very interesting place, as I'm sure we'll be seeing Ravonna again soon at some point, and with her comic connection to Kang, we can assume it will be in connection to another version of him that she either finds and grooms or falls in love with at some point down the timeline. Early in the episode, we see Miss Menace return right after having encountered Loki and Sylvie and gives Ravonna files that aren't what she requested, but says,
I know, but he thinks this'll be more useful.
which means Kang sent these to Ravonna to read, meaning there could have been a plan in place already before Sylvie killed him to team up with Ravonna, which is where she could now be heading off to. We know the pair are romantically connected in the comics, and it could work out that Ravonna is the one who shows up in the 31st century and sparks the first Kang's initial campaign. Whatever happens, a meaner Kang with the Ravonna Renslayer with eons of knowledge of the TVA and the timeline could be a very formidable force in the MCU to deal with. That maybe we see Ant-Man and Wasp encounter first. In the midst of Kang telling Loki and Sylvie how he came to be, we get the long-awaited rundown on his backstory.
A variant of myself lived on Earth in the 31st century, and he discovered that there were universes stacked on top of his own. Other versions of us were learning the same thing. Some of us. New worlds, new lands to be conquered.
Which is pretty close to his comic origins, in that Kang the Conqueror in the comics was born in the 30th century on Earth 6311, where peace had been restored to the Earth by the time-traveling legendary benefactor Nathaniel Richards from Earth 616. Kang the Conqueror was assumed to be born of this Nathaniel Richards, who was possibly a descendant of Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, or possibly even Doctor Doom. I loved how the MCU chose to introduce us to Kang here, and the visual illustrations used seemed a fitting device to fast track such a major character from the comics and his beginnings to a broader audience not in the know. Ultimately, the multiversal war being a result of the hubris of the many variants of Kang puts Jonathan Majors and the Nathaniel Richards character immediately into the upper echelon of past and future threats in the MCU, as this is a character with an infinite amount of knowledge of how things both past and present play out, and as such would make him nearly impossible to extinguish completely. It's left open for interpretation, but it's my belief that this Kang we encounter is actually the first Kang he discusses that initially discovered the universes stacked on top of one another, as that Kang was the one to eventually subjugate Elias and end the multiversal war, which he says he did before choosing to isolate his timeline and managing its flow. Him paying lip service to his Conqueror title was also pretty cool to see both times.
I've been dubbed many names by many people. A ruler, a conqueror.
Throughout the episode, there are various conversations about free will, which really drives home one of the main focuses of the series of the morality of taking it away for the supposed greater good, as we see Loki, Sylvie, Mobius, and Ravonna all continue to wrestle with it. Kang even calls Loki to flee on the back of a dragon at one point, and it would seem all of them come to their own terms with their own resolutions and are fine with leaving the outcome the way it's attached, which unfortunately, in my opinion, may mean doom for their future, as it spells trouble in the way of many Kangs possibly now appearing.
I knew everything up to a certain point.
Once they crossed the threshold of time of which Kang had no future knowledge, I was pretty certain at this point it meant he was going to die at the hands of Sylvie or Loki. The options he lays out on the table for them of either killing him and dealing with the repercussions of many variants of himself eventually rising up, or replacing him and assuming his power, at first glance didn't really come off at any point as something Loki or Sylvie would want. But I must admit, I was really hoping that Sylvie wouldn't get around to killing him. But of course she does, after duking it out with Loki and shuffling him back unceremoniously to ATVA, after finally giving us the moment of the pair kissing.
I just want you to be okay.
But I'm not you.
My favorite part of the episode, and possibly my favorite line from any MCU villain thus far, has to now be,
See you soon.
which to me seems promising for us the fans, but incredibly foreboding and sinister for the future of the MCU. Earlier in the episode, when Sylvie asks him what he's afraid of, and he says himself, I knew then that this older, jovial Kang we see wasn't in fact the Thanos level threat Kang we'll soon encounter. And although he's supposed to be a villain, I'm with Loki in that I do believe everything he told them was true, and that without him in the TVA there to keep the branches clipped from the timeline, things are going to get really bad really fast, which is confirmed for us once they cross the threshold and Sylvie kills him, and we begin to see the sacred timeline branch even further, both outside of the Citadel and even more so when we flash back to Mobius and Hunter B-15 at the TVA. While this may have given Sylvie the satisfaction of seeing her task completed, I don't believe she fully thought it through, as it would seem Loki had, making both what Kang and Loki told her prior seem even more true.
Grow up! Grow up, Sylvie! We're all villains here.
Because you can't trust, and I can't be trusted.
So with Kang now dead and Loki back at the TVA, I believe here's where we get to see Loki realize what it is he and Sylvie have actually done, as we see him traversing the halls looking for Mobius, whom he eventually finds with Hunter B-15, only to realize they have no idea who he is, as they spaz out about instructions from a he, which is followed by Loki looking left and revealing to us that all hell has broken loose and the statue of the 3 Timekeepers has now been replaced by a singular one of Kang, possibly the Conqueror, wearing his comic book accurate outfit. This scene alone has huge implications on what could possibly happen next, and before the post-credit scene even revealed it, I knew then we would get a season 2 of Loki. It has now been confirmed by industry insiders that Loki will in fact return in Doctor Strange 2: The Multiverse of Madness alongside the Sorcerer Supreme, Doctor Strange, and the Scarlet Witch. Which to me means things are about to go off the rails completely. It was here I realized that Sylvie must have somehow pushed our Loki into another timeline by accident, and that this TVA we see isn't the one we've been in all series. So we can assume Loki will have to make his way back to our timeline in season 2, and that Hunter B-15 and our Mobius and Sylvie will be looking for him as well. I don't believe there could have been a more chilling way to end this series, as this statue, to those in the know of what Kang is capable of, should be truly terrifying.
For all time.
Always.
Wrapping up, I have to say I really enjoyed this series overall. In terms of where it ranks for me against the other Marvel Disney Plus shows we've gotten so far, as I mentioned on my live stream spoiler discussion right after the episode dropped, WandaVision is still ultimately my favorite, with Falcon and the Winter Soldier coming in a close second. That in no way means I didn't like Loki, but I believe this series serves a far higher purpose in setting up Kang the Conqueror for the foreseeable future in the MCU, and as such I feel it lacked a little bit of the definitive punch we got from the other series. All of the acting throughout was amazing, and if anyone could be asked to come in the final episode and go up against the prior great performances from Tom Hiddleston, Sophia DiMartino, and Richard E. Grant, it would have to be Jonathan Majors, as I believe he completely stole the episode and possibly even the series in his debut. I loved his portrayal of Kang, as he seemed to perfectly balance jeer and jovialness with an intense level of foreboding and omnipotence, and really just owned the screen whenever he was on it or near it. Loki, among many other things, seems to have been the jumping off point for Marvel's entry into Secret Wars, and I can imagine when we do see Kang again in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, he won't be as nice to be around.
Wild.
I will of course be continuing to cover all live action Marvel and Star Wars Disney Plus content here on my channel, as well as films from all of the walks of life that I have the pleasure of watching. And when What If releases soon, we'll be covering it weekly as well. And if you feel so inclined, I would love to have you back here week in and week out to continue to cover it all with us. Again guys, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and click that bell for notifications if you've enjoyed our content here tonight. Jump down in the comments and let me know your thoughts. And while you're at it, be sure to check out some of the other content here on the channel. All of the necessary links are listed here below for you to keep up with the coming content and shareables. Please be sure to follow me on all social media platforms, or just the one you use most frequently. We are slowly but surely building a community here, and I would personally love for you to be a part of that. And last but not least, we have a merch store. So whether you see something you like or just simply want to support the channel, head on over to our shop and grab something, or grab everything. But again, thank you so much guys and gals for visiting here with us today. I really appreciate each and every viewing minute of your time you've given us. There's loads of content we'll be sending your way, so I'll be seeing you. But for now, be blessed. And it was written.
Across the nighttime, the city sleep inside. Yeah, hear her voice, shake my window, sweet seduce inside. Yeah, send me out into the nighttime, for walls won't hold me tonight.